All right, everyone. So, this is going to be the beginning of my series where I'm going to read to you a book that I wrote last year. That book is called The Varangian. So, I'm hoping this is all working out the way that I want it to work out. And yeah, I'm going to, the format here, I just think for this one, I'm going to do a little intro talking about, then I'm going to read you the first chapter. And then there afterwards, I am going to just read the chapter and do a little talk afterwards about, the history of it and what I was deciding to put into it. So many of the characters that I put into this are fictional. Many of them are real, and I will be certain to point those out after the fact. But for anybody who is curious, the Varangian is about a Viking who is present at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Now, if you know, you know. Uh, Yeah, and it is one of my favorite stories from history. So I I decided to write a whole book about it, and I absolutely loved it. And this is it. So without further ado, The Varangian, Part 1, The Varangian, Chapter 1, Raiding in Africa. June 1038, upon the northern coast of Africa. There is nothing in the whole of Midgard like raiding. Two ships rode swiftly through the pre-dawn air, the sun already showing a glow on the distant horizon. The men aboard rowed with care and caution to avoid the many red-brown stones that lurked beneath the wave. The village ahead of them must be ready. No doubt of such a thing could have filled their minds of any of the 100 men aboard either longship. These sailing Varangian had been patrolling the vessel lane for years now, and other ships were their lesser preference for target. A ship would carry only what a ship could carry. It was the outposts on land that held the wealth. Wealth was everything to the Varangian. They were the personal protection force of the emperor and paid out a tithe from their hoard to his coffer, but kept everything else. Allegiance made them guards. Wealth made them Varangian. Still had they 6 boat lengths before they reached the shore. Too long had they searched for this place, no doubt giving the pirates much time to prepare. The men on board made prayers and breathed the sweet air of life for what could be the last time, would be for many of them. Raiding was a special kind of excited panic. The enemy could be disorganized or prepared. They could be formed into blocks with command or madly running warriors who would charge at a time. The unpredictability of behavior was the only thing anyone could call constant. Ready, said the commander at the front, the young and powerful commander they followed. At the command, the men lay their oars down and turned to the front. They then took up their weapons and shields in preparation of the landing, the hardest part. 5 ship lengths. The vague outline and dark images started to solidify into stone houses and wooden beams cut from palm date trees. No warriors, no mounted defense. There appeared neither to be anyone on the roofs of the houses. Where are they? Asked one of the rowers who turned to look. He saw they were approaching quickly. 4 boat lengths. They are there, or they have fled. I see no boats. Perhaps they are awaiting for ambush, said the warrior behind him, still rowing. Gods may I be protected from such a death. Each man must die when his fate is set, said the Varangian who continued to row his partner's oar where he had slackened. Not for an instant did the oar slow. His oar was near the center on the right side of the longship. as important as all others, and thus vital. The black-haired raider turned to him, the man who lessened his effort on the oar. I pray the Norns have not set my death this day. The other turned and grabbed the oar again. Then he looked at the black-haired raider. He wore a heavy cloak across his back of thick white fur. What of you? Have you no prayers for yourself? The raider smiled, not turning from his focus. I am not to die this day. My death has been fated to be among the changing of kings. He spent a moment in total quiet, then glanced over his right shoulder at the commander who stood at the prow. The changing of kings. 2 boat lengths. Stow oars, the commander said as quietly as he could. Those at the front lifted their oars from the water and laid them along the center of the ship by the mast. This was carried on down the line of seats, and the difficulty on those still rowing grew immensely while they felt the ship slowing immediately. The raider lifted the oar with his rowing companion and stowed it similarly. 1 boat length. He hefted his weapon, the great axe of his father's blood. 1/2 boat length. The oars were stowed all along the ship, and its continued momentum carried it now. Just enough to take it to shore. Whatever else may come, these Fatimids are sure to feel their death this day. The prow of the ship scraped the sand as it crashed onto the beach, and the commander leapt from the side of the dragon that guided their way. And on we go with the Vikings. Harold shouted and drew his sword. The black-haired raider also leapt from the boat into the waist-high water and started to wade to the shore. Damn that man, he breathed in a low growl. I am only the second off the boat today. He rushed, trying to get to the sand before any more Varangian could jump from the ship and slow his way. This was not the day he died. He stopped at the shore and looked up at the dragon prow of the ship, nodding to it and raising his axe blade. The world was suddenly illuminated by many torches as the corsairs began to defend against the coming raid. They shouted alarm in their Seljuk tongue and readied defense and started to come from their tents and houses. The raider saw 2 of them to his right and turn. There would he start today. He wore a good kite shield at his back, a sword across his front, and a dagger on his belt. But these were not the weapons he fought with. They were ever present an option to him, but this axe was more than merely a weapon. It stood as tall as his impressive height, had a haft of sturdy wood, and a blade of most magic steel. The corsairs saw him approaching from the darkness of the sea, dripping with the salt water and pointing wildly. They ran toward him with curved swords and made to fight. The first readied to strike, but hesitated a moment, looking for an opening, and the raider stabbed, suddenly hitting his face with the highest point of his axe. He struck hard. The man's head bent back unnaturally as his own momentum tried to carry him forward, dead before he knew why. The raider instantly turned his attention to the other and pivoted his left foot, not to crash into the dead man. The other yelled something angry and swung a graceful arc with his sword. The raider pulled back his axe and stepped back fast, a huge effort straining every muscle in his body. He took full advantage of the corsair's missed swing and rocked back forward to crash into the man, sending him tumbling to the ground. He roared as he brought the axe up high and brought it down with power into the man's chest. He turned with a growl. The fight had begun. The blood was raging. Through his helmet, he saw the rest of the men forming into groups and knew he had better join one among these. Not wanting to leave his back exposed a moment, he ran to a group of his fellow sailing Varangian who were forming a shield wall of a score and took the right flank. Shield walls always had a weak place, and that was the right flank. Each man protected himself and the man to his left, with his shield forming a barrier that had worked in battle for countless centuries. But as the shield was held in the left hand, it allowed the farthest right flank to be exposed. Ever had it been a practice that the strongest warrior would hold the right side, a dangerous position, but one that garnered prestige and praise. The black-haired raider did not care to consider this. He did not take his shield from his back. He stood at the right flank, his huge form guarding, and his eyes scanning every direction for coming enemy. They must be holding up somewhere deeper in the camp, Harold called. There were a dozen dead already, but the bulk of the enemy must be ahead, as Harold had said. Raider did not look far ahead to where the enemy might be. He searched the darkness in front of him. He'd seen too many times that enemy warriors did not always stand forward and present their challenge to them. Arrows could come in and kill as easily as they could maim, or silent knives could slip from the shadows. As the standing guard, at the edge of the shield wall, he knew it was his place to protect his brothers and sisters from the unseen foe. Farther, keep your eye keen, he said to the axe. The glow of the coming sun was expanding before him in the far east, making clearer and clearer the camp. The wall extended in both directions as more warriors came to the sides, and raiders stepped back, allowing others to take the right flank. He walked along, straight-backed and proud as he looked through and among the village. In front of him was a small square between the houses where numerous tents were built, their walls sidings waving gently in the wind. Then beyond these he saw a wooden post, propped up between two X frames that a dozen horses were tied to. That was a handsome prize that he could barely believe had no guard. All the warriors must be somewhere ahead, awaiting the coming battle. Horses! Many of them! I count 14 head! Come, I'm going to claim them! A warrior yelled, and left the wall to go toward them. Just as the raider watched her wend through the tents, he realized that the horses could be left there as a trap. By that time, though, 20 others were chasing after her, going for the plunder. He watched them break their from the formation and run carelessly through the unexplored village. Wait! He yelled and broke through from behind the shield wall to go with them. He had a terrible feeling that they would be surrounded and cut off. True as he thought, he watched an enemy sword come from a tent and stab a Varangian in the neck. He grit his teeth in anger and charged. The man had the time to turn and see him bearing down as he split his head with the axe. The tents! Watch the tents! He yelled. At that moment, he looked around and found he was between 4 tents and alone, but for the dead man at his feet, the others having gone farther toward the horses. A moment later, Hafald and Inga walked into the space between 4 tents, seeing only a dead corsair and a Varangian on the ground. There must be more who have gone for the horses, Inga began. We should go keep their backs cleared of enemies. I am not taking orders from a woman, Hafald replied. Inga only laughed. Leave the taking of them to me, then, she taunted, walking backwards toward them. Hafald started to walk after her, smiling under his helmet. Inga's eyes then grew wide as she saw a man slip out from a tent, scimitar held ready and eyes blazing with anger. No, Hafod! Inga yelled, bringing up her shield and running toward him. Hafod started to turn, but would not ready himself in time. A shadow appeared in the brightening morning, and the corsair was thrown to the side in a huge blow. The raider rushed over the man with his momentum. The corsair stumbled into a deft roll and managed to stand in an impressive display. He landed in a fighting crouch with streams of sand twisting in the air around him. Quickly, he analyzed the foes and started to back away from them. Coward, the black-haired raider called him and hastened forward. The corsair, who had to stand and fight or turn and be cut down. He swung, and the raider caught the blow on his axe blade, and then turned his whole body left in a swift turn and struck the man in the head with the butt of his weapon. The corsair stumbled, dazed, and swung his scimitar wildly. The raider had not stepped toward him, and so the swing caught nothing. Stand, he ordered. The man did not understand, of course. Stand, he shouted and stepped forward quickly. He struck the man in the chest. The others heard his ribs crack as the axe dug into him. He let the axe handle go, and the man was pushed rather than fell to the sands, dead. We need more. Others went to the horses, and I think they are a trap. He turned to where the rest of the party was following behind and fell for behind the forward wall. You all, come! We have need! Seven heard his call and detached from the army to join with them. Watch the tents! He ordered. They all nodded and ran off for the horses. The raider then walked to where his axe still lay in the man's chest. He paused a second before kneeling to retrieve it. Something in his awareness gave him a warning. He stood up tall and looked around, knowing that a secret arrow could take him through the eye hole of his helmet at any moment. Odin, Allfather, see me in my conquest. Watch as I lay my enemy aside with the axe of my father, whose haft was made of the branch of Yggdrasil. May my father and mother laugh as they see my war glory in this realm. He looked around, thinking he would see winged warrior women with cloaks of feathers in the clouds about him, the Valkyries, come to take the soul of the slain to the hall. But he saw only the dim morning sky. He truly felt in that moment alone in the Midgard, the realm of humans, but knew there was presence of the gods around him. Then his awareness grew hot as he felt something to the right, and he pulled his axe free fast. He turned and crouched, his armor making a loud shink as he stopped the bat in battle-ready stance. And there was nothing in front of him but more of the tents. Something was there, though. He needed to go to his companions, the other Varangian. All of them were absorbed in the act of taking their prize, their backs all to the tents. Purpose and presence. The raider looked back to the square, and they were there, coming from elsewhere in the village. 4 more corsairs came to take advantage of the distraction of the horses. He stood and faced them. You will go no further, he said to them. Their confidence in victory was plain on their faces. The raider backed up slowly, keeping his eye on the coming enemy. When he saw the stone of a house on his right and the wall of a tent on his left, he stopped. The narrowness of this space would rob their advantage of number. See me in my conquest. They sprang forward. He stood between them and their targets, and the excitement of easy kills propelled their step. but they were overcommitted. Without coordination, their first corsair swung with his sword. The raider knew that if he backed too far, he'd pass the tent and allow them to move past him. He caught the swing with the top of his axe and pushed through the man's own force and sliced his neck with the blade. The corsair behind him swung down in a high chop, which he sidestepped. Then, once the scimitar was below his waist, he swung his right arm up and hit him in the nose with the haft. He struck hard, and the man was thrown back, blood spewing from his face. The other two, having seen their comrades beaten, still approached with savagery and little caution. He ducked a cut from the left, and the man nearly stumbled into him. He managed to use his axe and turn the man just in time to catch the other sword with his body. He yelled in pain, and the raider pushed him back to where he fell to the ground. The final corsair, having just slashed his friend, screamed with frustration, striking again with wild fury. He slashed left and right quickly, and the raider turned back and forth with practiced movements. He learned the rhythm, as dangerous as it was to stay in the pattern. Then, when his axe was on his right side and the strike was blocked, he stabbed the man in the side of the head with the upper tip of the blade. He pushed with all his strength and stepped forward, lifting the man off his feet and throwing him down. The raider, with the white bear cloak, his chain shirt now reddened with blood, stood there over the dead, his slain foe. He breathed heavy in the early dawn air. For an instant, he saw himself standing alone in the cold, snowy land of his birth, his breath clouding in the icy winds, the dead at his feet, all the dead, all the death he had dealt out in the world. He had sent to their doom. He stood alone. Raider walked from the place and went to where the horses were. He saw the others working to collect the mounts for their own plunder and looked around in near panic as he knew something was coming. We need the horses. We were led here. He looked up. No Valkyrie will show their self to me before I am ready. None were listening to him. Get up those horses! He shouted the command, and the others now looked at him. We will lead them back to the boats, said one who'd already untied his rein. No! We are needed where the army is meeting with the enemy. We need to get there now. He ran to the post and jumped onto the back of the nearest horse. Then he swung his axe and cut the tie. He grabbed the rein. Follow and fight, or there will be much bloodshed of the others, he said with conviction, and the rest stared a moment at him. Inga, the woman who'd walked through the tents before with a large hafald, jumped up onto another horse. She had put her shield across her back and had only a good long sword ready for the fight. Well, lead us to where you think we are most needed, Fitbjorn, she said. Fitbjorn, White Bear, the black-haired raider. It was the only name he'd given anyone. Others were mounted and ready, and they all rode off. The post had been at the nearest, at the west side of the village, and they rode now south along the outside of it, two of them keeping bows and arrows ready to their left in case of enemy. They rode until they saw what they were looking for. A two-story bastion stood at the far south side of the village, and the enemy force rallied around it. The raider pressed his mount on faster, forcing the others to keep pace, and raced to join their host. The rest of the mounted Varangian followed along, keeping their shields fixed against the village in case of someone rushing them in surprise. He rounded the outside curve of the village until seeing the rest of their army, all gathered together behind their shields and standing against the corsair that were standing rather than fleeing into the desert. Seems they were well aware of the fate if they were defeated. Harold was a harsh man. His treatment of these pirates was death upon capture. No release without weapon would ever be enough to dissuade their continued dedication to this life. There was no more opportunity, and the rewards were too great. These men should have taken their horses and goods and gone into the country to disappear behind them. Were the seas of dunes, vast sands of the Sahara, and they would do far better to fight from the position there, away from the boats. The sailing Varangian would be fools to leave them unguarded, and thus would have to split their force to pursue, if they chose that path. But the corsairs chose to stand and fight. Even these pirates. The raider looked upon their resolve as they faced down an impossible odd. He could not press down the sense of respect for them as they chose the honor of the fight over the greater chance for victory. He shook his head of this strange sense and pressed on faster. He and the others rode to the far flank and dismounted their horses, being watched the whole time by the corsairs, some even shooting arrows at them to no effect. We land here, shields together. They're going to try with more arrows. You there! My name's Ragnar, laddie. I told you that yesterday. Stay with your bow and shoot. The others formed into a wall around him. He himself took his shield from his back and added to the wall. Now push! We don't want to engage at full force. If we stand at least... if we can at least keep their back distracted, we give the front a better fight. But if they do come, we pull back and destroy them all. They all, once standing in a solid stance, shouted their agreement and advanced slowly and unstoppably. Those in front wrapped their weapons on the shield tops. The raider with the white bear cloak stalked back and forth behind them, scanning for any who'd try and flank the formation. The whole battle thereafter was not long, but it was bloody and hard fought. Those in the shield wall, once seeing the ranks of enemy being dwindled to the point where victory or survival was impossible, slowed their advance and stood to block retreat. While standing, they began their celebrations, but the raider continued to walk along the back and front of the shield wall. He felt he could foresee what a desperate enemy might try. Thrice, he even needed to act on his anticipations and cut down a fleeing pirate. Other times, Ragnar shot them with arrows to stay them. Between their advance from the back and the continued encirclement from Harold at the front and flanks, the whole enemy army was destroyed. Thitbjorn the raider stood finally, watching over the dead enemy and joyous sailing Varangian. All the glory of this day, no matter how many he had saved or how many enemy he felled, belonged only to one man. It was no longer Girger, the man who had commanded this fleet, and importantly, it was not the raider with the black hair and the white bear cloak. The man who ruled here, the true king of these ships, was Harald Sigurdsson, the exiled royal from Norway, who fled the battlefield, who escaped and made for the Rus, where he warred and raided, gaining riches and renown. He came to Miklagard and joined with the Varangian, furthering his wealth and power. It seemed that the raider would never be able to escape hearing tales of wonder and genius and power of this Harald Sigurdsson, the man he owed his fealty to, the man whose sail he rode under. The raider stood there and stared at the man, all war-proofed and wrapped in the glory of this day. Just yet another in the long line of victory for the valiant raiding war prince. His ambition was legend. His prowess in war was attested and spoken of. He was the famous one. For too long had he looked on that man as he did. Every raid, every fight, every feast and horn of good mead or wine, there was every intent within him to surpass Harald Sigurdsson in all things. To be the greatest Norse who ever lived, the most famous of the Varangian, the strongest Vikinger. The gods would have a place for him at the high table, where he would share in the feasting, a place in the courtyard where he could spend all time fighting and training for the great war on the field of Vigrid, fighting the forces of darkness in the last battle at Ragnarok. But while he still stood upon Midgard, it was his vow that someday he would achieve his vengeance and kill this Lord Harald Sigurdsson. End of chapter 1. Yes, so that is the end of chapter 1. Now I'm going to give a quick description of all the things that we're going through there. Harald Sigurdsson, of course, was an exile from Norway. At the age of 15, he fought at a battle called Stiklestad, where Olaf the Saint, his half-brother, was killed. Olaf II, he is sometimes called, King Olaf. Harold was wounded, he had to escape, he found his way to a small cottage, and then he left east towards the land of the Rus, to the court of a king Yaroslav, called Yaroslav the Wise. And then, afterwards, a man named Kulf Arneson, who is said to have been the one to deal the death blow to King Olaf, came to the court of King Yaroslav. Again, forcing Harold, who had spent the interim years as a mercenary, to flee south. When he fled south, he found the court of Byzantium, which is called Byzantium in later years. We call it now Istanbul when it was called Constantinople. At this time, around 1038 or so, which is when the beginning of the book, of course, just happened, it was the court of Emperor Michael IV, called the Paphlagonian. And it was the eastern half of the Roman Empire, the very center of the earth. The word Mediterranean, for example, you'll probably be able to dissect its small little Latin pieces. Medi, medium, terra, terranean. Mediterranean literally just translates to Middle Earth. Lord of the Rings, completely unrelated, I'm sure. But so that is where Harold found himself. And of course, as I also mentioned, he was under the command of a man called Girger, Michael Girger. And then through a bit of conniving, we'll get into later chapters, he found himself eventually, after all of his raiding and all of his prowess and much wealth gained, he became the great commander of all the Varangian. Quick history of the Varangian now. They actually started out as raiders. They were mercenaries traveling through the land. Of course, the incredibly famous Ironside, Bjorn Ironside, Ragnar's son, he went his way to the Mediterranean. Many, many other Vikinger went to the Mediterranean thereafter, and they found themselves in this most beautiful place, Constantinople. They called it Miklagard. That was their name for the city. So they found a Miklagard, and they were these big, hulking, white-skinned warriors. The emperors looked upon them and said, "Do you want to be my personal guard?" because with a guard such as this, I would be known as more than a man. Of course, the question came up, how much would you pay us? And the answer was given, a lot. I would pay you a lot of money if you became my guard. And so they became the guard to the emperor himself. News of the great wealth that they were earning traveled all the way back to the Scandinavian countries, and all of a sudden, all these hot-blooded warriors who were bored with raiding each other, these adventurers and questers and explorers, they all came to Miklagard to serve in the guard of the emperor of the eastern half of the Roman Empire. So many, in fact, that eventually the emperors found themselves in possession of an entire private army. And so by the time of Harold Sigurdsson, they split that army into three parts. There were the guard of the city, there were the mercenary Varangian, and there were the sailing Varangian. Guard of the city is pretty well explained. Guard of the city, personal guard of the emperor. Because when the emperor is walking around all decked out in his finery with jewels upon his fingers, necklaces, great golden crosses around his neck, and a crown, and he has 2 or 12 hulking berserker warriors around him, that is more than a man. That is an emperor. The mercenary Varangian, of course, just a private army. Go off into the lands of Palestine, go to the lands of Syria, go to the lands of the Jordan, and fight for me. Go into the lands of Anatolia, modern day Turkey. Go into the lands of the Bulgars. Go to the Italy, and go to Africa. Vikings were raiding the coast of Africa. And no one has told this story before. So I wrote this book because I found it such a fascinating part of history. And finally, there are the sailing Varangian. Basically, privateers, if you know what that part of history is. Sanctioned by the Emperor of Rome, Vikings, sailing around and raiding the Mediterranean at the behest of the Emperor of Byzantium. It's incredible. These things happened. So in this story, I have introduced you to most of the main characters, the big and important ones, of course. Fitbjorn, our main hero, who wears the cloak of a white bear around his shoulders, and who has vowed vengeance against this Harald Sigurdsson, whom history knows as Harald Hardrada. Some have even called the last great Viking king. But that is a story for another time. For now, I bid you all thanks.